Hi, today we're going to be talking about pieced backgrounds. And what I like about doing a pieced background is it adds a lot of extra interest and texture to your project. It's also a really good way to use up some scraps of little pieces of fabric that that are not big enough to do embroidery or applique on by themselves. So this is an example of an embroidery that I did using a pieced background. And you can see that just having those different fabrics in the background make it a little bit more interesting and fun. Here is some machine applique done on a pieced background, and at the end of this video I'm going to show you how to make one of these kind of crazy quilt looking backgrounds. It's a really fun way to use up your scraps. So this is just a really simple pieced background. It was just 4 squares that I sewed together. And the first thing you want to remember when you are doing a pieced background is you want to press your seams open. That's going to kind of distribute the bulk on the back, because if you press your seams to one side, what's going to happen is when you're doing your stitching or your applique, you're going to end up in some areas where the seams are, where you're going to have 3 layers of fabric, and that can just be a little bit hard to get your needle through, and it can be a little bit bulky. So press your seams open. The next thing you'll want to do is make sure that you have the center of your block, which you're going to be embroidering or appliquing on. So for this block, it's really easy to tell where the center is. It's just where all of these seams meet in the middle. But let's say you had a different kind of a block where you don't have all the seams in the middle, or even if you're just using a solid piece of fabric, the easiest way to find your center is to just take your block, fold it in half, and kind of finger press it in the center. And then if you open it up and fold it the other directions and finger press it in the center when you open it up, you'll be able to find the center of your block that way. Next, you will need to find the center of your pattern. So in this pattern, because I knew that I was going to be instructing people to use it on a pieced block, I marked the center right there of the pattern. But not all patterns will have the center marked for you. So it's really pretty easy to find the center of a pattern. What I usually do, so you'll see this one doesn't have the center marked, I will take a pen and just find the highest point on the pattern, which would be the top of the D on this pattern, and then the lowest point, which would be just along the row of the little vases there. And then I'll also mark the widest parts of the pattern. And I've used a red pen so that you can see it a little bit better. And then what I do is, and this might be easier to do in front of a window or a light box, but I will take the paper and at first I will line up top to bottom. So I will just take this and line up those lines. Like I said, it's a little bit easier if you're doing it in front of a window or a light box, but I can see it pretty well there. So I'm just going to crease it there, and then I'll open it up, and then I'm going to do the same thing left to right. I'm going to line up those lines that I've drawn and crease it, and there I have where those folds intersect. I found the center, and then I'll just use a pen to mark the center of that, so it's really easy to line up with the center of my block. So the reason that you want to find the center is if you were just using a solid piece of fabric, you would just go ahead when you're done with your applique or your embroidery and trim the block with equal amounts of fabric on each side of the design. But when you've got a pieced block, you've got to make sure that you don't have these seams, say the center seam kind of skewed to the left or to the right where it's going to be really noticeable. You want the seams of your block to be centered with the embroidery pattern when you trim it. So that's why it's important to make sure that you have your design centered on the pieced block. So here is the pattern that I want to trace onto my pieced background, and I found the center of it using the method that I just showed you a minute ago by folding the paper in half and then in half again. And so I want to get that little dot, that's the center of my pattern, lined up with the center of the pieced background. Now it can be a little bit hard even with a light box to see through the seams. So what I do is I kind of eyeball it, and then I will just kind of keep moving it until I've got the center of the pattern about lined up with the center of the fabric, and get it straightened out. And then when I get it where I want it, I will just use a regular piece of Scotch tape, and I just tape my fabric to the pattern. I always tape my fabric to my patterns when I'm tracing because it just keeps things from sliding around and moving. So here's a pattern that I've traced onto my fabric. And you can see there were some areas here right where the seams fall where it was hard, even with the light box turned on, to see the pattern. So what I've done is I just left those blank where I couldn't see it. And I'm going to remove the pattern. And what I can do is just use this pattern as a reference to fill in any areas that I missed. So I can see there's a part of a stem and a leaf there that I missed. So I can just kind of freehand that in. Here I can see I missed part of the wing. So I can freehand that in. And then the same thing over here. That sometimes when your pattern is very detailed, it's hard to see the lines through the seams. Another thing that you could try to do is to just, if you've got areas where you're having a hard time seeing, like look at your fabric first on your pattern and just see the areas where you're not going to be able to maybe see through those seam allowances. And what you can do is grab a Sharpie and go in and darken those lines up. And that may make it easier for you to see those areas so that you can trace them easier. So now that I have my pattern traced onto my pieced background, the next thing I want to do is sew interfacing to the back. Now, usually I say that the interfacing is optional for embroidery or applique, but in this case, you really need to add the lightweight fusible interfacing. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is you've got these seam allowances here, and if you don't use the interfacing to kind of tack those down, what's going to happen is as you're stitching, they can start to flip up and create a lot of bulkiness on the back and some like not nice areas on the back. So just as we usually do, I'm going to take the interfacing, I'm going to put it on the back, make sure the seams are nice and flat, and just fuse that in place according to the manufacturer's instructions. Another reason that we want to use interfacing on the back of a pieced background is that because you're using different fabrics, the fabrics can be slightly different weight and have a slightly different stretch to them. And so this kind of stabilizes the whole thing for your stitching process so that it'll just help to lay nice and flat once you're done. And then finally, another reason is when you are doing embroidery on a pieced background like this, I try to avoid doing stitching right along the seam lines, but sometimes just depending on the way a pattern falls, you can't help it. So like here you can see on this pattern, this line, the straight line of the top of this flower pot fell almost right on this seam. And what you want to do is if you have that interfacing on the back, even if your stitches fall right into that seam allowance between the two pieces of fabric, you're going to have something on the back of your fabric for your stitches to kind of grab onto and to stabilize them. So that's another good reason for using interfacing when we do a pieced background. So now I want to show you a way to make a pieced background, which is really a fun way of doing it. And it's good for if you've got some really unusually sized and shaped scraps. So here I just went into my scrap basket and I pulled out a bunch of light fabrics that are, as you can see, just a variety of shapes and sizes. And usually I start with the biggest one first. So I think I will start with this one. And now maybe I'll take this one too. And so I'm going to place them right sides together. And I'm going to get kind of a I want to put the straight edges together like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew that together. So now that I've sewn these two pieces together along the long edge, I want to press the seam allowance open. But you'll notice that I don't have a nice straight edge over here to add a piece to. So what I want to do is I just want to trim this with my rotary cutter. So now I trimmed that edge and made a nice straight edge, and I can sew another piece on that it's about the same length. So now I've sewn this seam here. I can press it open again. And I actually happen to have a straight edge here if I wanted to do this, but I think it would be really interesting maybe to do something diagonal there. So I think I'm going to go and trim that edge off. So now I've trimmed that edge off to give myself a nice straight edge, and I think I like this fabric and I want to sew that on there, but it's not quite long enough. So what I could do actually is grab yet another piece of fabric. I think I'm going to piece these two pieces of fabric together first. So now I've pieced these two pieces together to get a piece that's long enough, and I can sew along this edge, and then I will open that up, and then you just keep going and you keep adding onto it till you get a piece that's as big as you need. So just remember, the method here is to sew two straight edges together, press the seams, trim off another straight edge, and then sew another straight edge to that, and then you just keep going. So now I have this large, unusually shaped piece of pieced fabric. I can just cut this down to the size that I need and use it in my project. So there's our pieced background. You can see it has kind of a crazy quilt look to it, and it's a fun way to use up all of those odd little bits of scraps. And you can use this for embroidery or applique. I recommend it more for applique. If you want to use it for embroidery, choose a pattern that's not too detailed. If you have a very detailed embroidery pattern, it may get frustrating trying to trace over all of these different seam allowances. And whether for applique or embroidery, you do definitely want to use that interfacing on the back, because you've got seams going in all different directions, and you're going to want that interfacing to keep all of those seams flat and tidy.